Yo guys, what up, Viper here, and today we have the Illuvium patch 0.40, which is just like private beta 4 pretty much, and there's a lot of changes not only to the overworld, and we can actually play, and it's on testnet and airdrop farming season and so on and so on. A lot of stuff there, but today I want to unpack the changes to the Illuvium arena, buffs, nerfs, new things added, a bunch of cool stuff, so let's get into it. Alright, so this is just like Illuvium website, right? Patch notes on the website. You can all get that on the link from the announcements in the Discord and so on. So let's dive into the rest, right? The general gameplay changes, first of all, I think this is pretty interesting. So we are not having god accounts in that sense anymore, where we just have everything unlocked. We actually have to farm things in the overworld, and then we can only start playing with them. As a free rotation of Illuvials gears and weapons, the players can freely use. Nice, that's like how it's gonna be once the game is on mainnet as well. And the starter decks are also available for players to use. Okay, so we can just like play on day one if we want to, especially to figure out some of the route changes and so on. But besides that, we have to go and farm our stuff, which I think I like a lot. I've not been a super big fan of the, I don't know, just giving god account to everybody. It just made it that literally everybody I make a new video, I stream something, and 5 minutes later, everybody just copies it, right? That kind of sucks, so I'm happy to see this. So if somebody wants to just copy whatever the newest video is, they actually do have to spend some time farming the Illuvials and the weapons and so on. Then the changes to mastery point system. They lowered the amount of mastery points gained per round. I think that makes sense because with the initial setup where we had Illuvials plus Augments, and Augments costed a substantial amount of mastery points, well, you made boards that were like 1,000 mastery points plus easily, right? But now we can't really do that anymore because augments are free, so we don't need as much mastery points. I think that's a good change. Ascension tokens, we used to get 0 on the first turn and then 2 on every turn afterwards. Now we get 1 on the first, 1 on the second, and then we get 2, 2, 2, and then we get 3 onwards. So we just have like on turn 6, we have 1 more coin than we used to before. On turn 7, it's 2, on 8, it's 3 more coins. So the issue, or I guess not the issue, but the feedback that was given was essentially around turn 6, you kind of just have established your board, and you also on turn 6, usually you have some mastery points left over for moving Illuvials. So you can, I don't know, move on turn 5, move a little bit on turn 6 usually, because you don't have to spend everything on developing on turn 5 even. You can spend some on moving. And yeah, then on turn 7, even if you have spent points on moving Illuvials before, you just had nothing to do. And the game just became like a super coin flippy on the positioning because everybody could just move every unit for free without any drawback to it, right? Usually you want to have some like input in terms of, well, if you do this play that increases your power level, then you lose some utility, which utility is like you move your Illuvials around or you go power level, but just every player had max power level plus utility every single turn, so that was pretty boring. Having more Ascension tokens and less mastery points combined hopefully changes that, and yeah, I'm looking forward to that. That certainly didn't feel really good. And then further, we have far more Illuvials, which I hope is going to change a lot of the other things that I had criticized in previous videos and when I was streaming a lot as well, because the game felt really good in the first like 2 months that we played the last private beta. Actually, no, it wasn't a private beta, it was a public beta PvP, right? Actually, everybody was allowed to play, yeah. So the game felt really good when we played essentially front-to-back team comps, when we had like ranged carries, or when we had drain tanks, basically. So what is a drain tank? It's like something that takes damage and then heals back up again by dealing damage or some health regeneration or something like that, aka Phosphorus, right? The old Bloom. And then there's the Arcanite Snake, Fyrox, and Scoriox, ranged damage dealer, and Devil Invoker. That was essentially the meta for the first like 2 months-ish time, and also like ranged Tsunami Enchanter meta. But yeah, it was mainly like ranged carry oriented and these like melee sustain damage oriented guys. But then we shifted to pretty much just like a melee versus melee carry stuff, and it was more glass cannon-y, because like, yes, behemoths are a bit tanky and so on, and you had mystic shields and so on healing them, but they were no phosphorus, right? Like they didn't actually just tank stuff for the ranged damage dealer behind them. And in that, the positioning coin flip was really, really bad. So I hope that more Illuvials and having access to all the trades will change that a whole lot. Because that is one of the main things before. we had access to a lot of the composites only via the bonding of our ranger. Now we can make every composite in the game by just playing Illuvials. So that brings us to the drop bear line, for example. Drop bear, fire rogue becomes predator, becomes a wildfire, and the ability is to blind enemies in a medium area around them and deal a lot of single target damage. So it's some utility, it's high single target damage, it's what the rogues want, and it is a predator wildfire. Wildfire is like a damage-y, sustain-y thing, which kind of fits well with the blind, so you can maybe just get another blind off and so on. The interesting thing here is I think it's a predator on stage 2, so getting access to 2 predator Illuvials is very, very cheap, especially with the Ascension system, because they're both stage 2s. Then we have the Fennec Fox line. It's a tier 3 air empath that becomes dust and then becomes enchanter, and the ability is you gain a shield for 4 seconds, you mesmerize the 2 furthest enemies, charming them for a duration and dealing energy damage. Charm duration goes up by the higher stage, and yeah, damage and energy, physical damage. One of these is probably meant to be a shield, I assume. Like one of them is probably shield, one of them is energy damage, if I read the description correct. Should message someone about that. I think the cool thing here is that we have an enchanter that gives you backline access, because enchanter teams usually, first of all, you need to bond your ranger for that, which limited a lot of other things. And then second of all, you just played a front to back every time, but you didn't have any access to the backline of the enemy. You didn't really have any like ranged CCs or anything outside of some versions that could play Twine, Null, or Cling, the Sloth line that CC'd the furthest away enemy. And this is doing the exact same thing. It's like crowd control effect on the furthest away enemy. So you can essentially blow up the enemy melee and frontline stuff with the enchanter shields. That's what enchanter is really, really good at doing. Plus you have access to the enemy backline with crowd control effect. So you have more time killing the frontline before your frontline gets killed by the enemy ranged damage dealers. I think it's very strong. Illuvial very strong ability, and it should make a lot of fights more interesting. Also, Dust being the blind on Omega on the front line and so on. So yeah, just very, very high utility Illuvial that incredibly well fits into the Enchanter team comps. Then we have the Mammoth line. It's tier 4 Psion, becomes Tempest and Harbinger. Having a second Tempest makes Kukaref, especially we've seen Enchanter is getting better, and the other Enchanter is also an Air Illuvial. Then we get another Air Psion Illuvial here that becomes Tempest. So maybe we see some Kukaref and Mahmut frontline with the Tempest essentially giving them a crazy amount of dodge chance. Mammoth levitates the nearest enemy and throws them at the farthest enemy, dealing energy damage in a medium area on impact. So it just sounds like a really, really good thing for front to back fighting team comp. That essentially just means, well, this is accessing the furthest away enemy, this is accessing the furthest away enemy. Maybe you have a ranger with a Psion weapon shooting at the furthest away enemy, and so on and so on. So you have some backline access, even though you're playing a Enchanter team comp potentially. And then we also have Harbinger, which either can make it far more tanky, or we can use Harbinger to just buff, for example, our Psion Ranger, which could be the carry in Enchanter to actually make the Gauntlet deal significant damage again. Then we have the Podelmorph line. Podelmorphs take to the skies, becoming airborne and dashing towards the farthest enemy. As it dashes, it sets the ground aflame in a medium area, dealing energy damage over 5 seconds. Really, really interesting here. It starts Fire Psion, then becomes Inferno, and then becomes Phantom. So the stage 2 Inferno, it starts as a Psion Illuvial in the backline, and once it casts the ability, it just dashes to the furthest enemy, right? So you probably deal a lot of AoE damage to the entire enemy team, but you also jump into the fray, most likely, and maybe you're easily getting killed. And then you lose your Inferno damage output. Now, if you're a stage 3 Phantom, that's a rogue composite, right? You jump into the enemy backline, maybe you tank damage, and then you cast your ability, and maybe you just go towards safety then, because you're going to the furthest away enemy when you start in the backline is probably some like frontline tanky thing, especially combined with other rogues. Yeah, this is really interesting positioning wise, because you have a rogue and a non-rogue version, and the unit themselves actually dashes to the furthest enemy. And yeah, it just deals a good amount of damage. A Phantom, obviously, crazy higher multiplier for any Omega power ability based thing. And then this also is a Psion base, so you can easily have like 200 Omega power plus Phantom on something like this. Very, very scary, and probably a crazy assassin for just enemy backline units. Very difficult to position around. Then we have the red panel line. It's a tier 1 firefighter Illuvial that becomes Templar and then Shock. Templar, really interesting, was also one of the composites that we could only access with the Ranger. And now we can actually have, for example, Blazer Knight plus this guy, just have 2 Templar and use the Ranger for something else, or maybe even have a 3 Templar all together. And yeah, ability is pretty much, it is a lot of text, but it's just like, well, your auto attacks either do extra damage and they steal some stats, or they give some like healing and health. It's like this empath-y kind of feeling and a fighter combination out of it. I don't know, it's not really flashy. It's very interesting though. Fighter is essentially really high attack speed buff. So having a fighter base, like a fighter dominant Illuvial becoming Templar, is interesting because he might become really, really tanky, stacking a lot of resistances, which then might make this like stealing max health percent and sharing it with a low health ally really, really scary. As if you have a lot of resistances, then stealing health and healing something seems very, very OP. The Tree Kangaroo line is a really cool design in my opinion, because the little guy, the little, I don't know, baby kangaroo is gonna get left behind, and the big kangaroo jumps to the enemy backline, and then the big kangaroo is just like a rogue, and if you kill something, that's like part of the ability. Takedown just means kill or assist. Tree Kangaroo gains physical attack damage and it grants energy attack damage to a little one. So yeah, it's just like a very takedown oriented rogue, which synergizes well with it becoming a Revenant on stage 2 and a Shock on stage 3. Especially Shock is pretty interesting. Shock is like single target damage to weak enemies that is more or less like assassinating them. So you should be able to get a lot of Revenant triggers of this due to a Shock as well. And then the whole kit of this evolves around this takedown thing. Now, this sounds really, really OP, like the way the kit works, the synergies work and everything together, but it's still a tier 1 Illuvial, so the base stats are probably not the most crazy ones. I don't know if this is going to be a hyper carry for your team, but it's certainly going to be super, super efficient unit, and especially very strong in the earlier stages of the game. Like Shock is supposed to be very good early game anyways, and this whole thing seems very, very strong early game. Then some Illuvial balance changes after the others were released. Pterodactyl gets nerfed. That makes sense. Pterodactyl was benefiting a whole lot of the recent changes. Scorpion line gets a buff. Ability doesn't take as long to cast anymore. I think that's really, really good because it's a fighter-based thing, and casting an ability that honestly doesn't do a whole lot for a lot of time, really, really annoying. Then Anteater line, small adjustments in Anteater's Omega to make it feel responsive. Sure, that's nice, whatever. Monkey line, small nerfs to the Monkey line. Okay, makes sense. There's not too much to talk about this here, right? Then the Tenrek line. I just want to call them Hedgehogs, but Tenreks I guess sounds cooler. I mean, it's correct, right? They are Tenreks. Now that we have a new dust unit, there's an extra reason to play Tenrek. We're lowering its Omega damage to be more in line with its tier. There's a pretty crazy nerf on the damage output. But then again, especially with the new Augment system and some of the base trade changes and so on, I think the unit was benefiting a whole lot like all the other rogues. And having the extra dust unit obviously makes this far, far stronger than it was before, because now we can access the composite without the ranger committing the bonding. Our axolotl line, a really interesting change, because the shield duration usually was higher on the higher stages, and now the shield duration is lower. But if your shield like persists and then it times out, instead of the opponent breaking it, you deal damage. So this is essentially a buff to the damage dealing capabilities of the axolotl line, and it's essentially a nerf to the tank capabilities of it. It's pretty interesting. We've only really been playing it as a tank so far, so I'm looking forward to seeing if this is going to be a damage dealing menace now, especially also with there being a Harbinger Illuvial added to the game, so maybe we can just make some cool stuff happen with Axolotl. Penguin line getting buffed, yep, makes sense. Penguin line always felt very underwhelming on the damage output side. So the biggest buff is on Slappin, right? 15 to 30. That's a 100% increase, and then here's only a 50% increase. Here's only a 33% increase. So Slappin, crazy buff. Maybe Slappin, some early game rogue team comps is gonna just wipe enemy boards now and be super, super efficient. I don't know if it does a whole lot for slashing though. Terror Bird line is getting buffed again. It really, really does deserve to get buffed. The changes to Bloom. I really don't like the new Bloom. I think the health region one just was good, and I think it was like healthy for the game to have this drain tank kind of Illuvial in the game, because we just don't have that. That's like a very big difference to TFT, in my opinion, where TFT melee damage dealers are usually these like drain tanky guys that just are frontline. They take a lot of damage, they deal a lot of damage, they heal against the damage and so on. And Phosphorus was really that, and now it just isn't anymore, right? Like nothing in Illuvium really is this drain tanky kind of thing. They all essentially just need healing support to just survive, and they're like very glass cannon-y, very easy to die if they're focused and so on. So yeah, I don't know, I really liked Bloom the way it was before it got changed, but it is what it is now. So yeah, you need to buff this unit tremendously to make up for taking the good trade entirely away from it, pretty much. Now, Tiktalik's heal is split into two parts. From usually it was just healing over time to now it's an initial heal that scales for mega power into a smaller over time part. I think this makes a lot of sense because it just didn't have no mega power scaling, which is like weird. It doesn't attack, so no attack damage, no crit, no attack speed, and like the only things that mattered were health and defensive stats. Now mega power matters a little bit, but it's not too crazy as well, right? So there's no like, I don't know, some super exploitable OP augments or team comps probably. It's a pretty small number on both sides. I think I like this. I think it makes a lot of sense. Then we have the stage 3 arcane things. This was slightly reworked. Instead of granting bonuses to allies hit by the wave, they debuff the enemies hit by the wave. I think that makes a lot of sense because Lynxes have a low attack range, so it was always really annoying to position for this, and it was never really a consideration that anybody did. So having them debuff the enemy just is a fundamentally better change to that. And now all the typos will give a sheet to allies in medium area like the water typo always did, and increasing the hex radius of the Omega at all stages. I like that. I think the Omega radius was feeling a bit annoying, and some of the typos just like having no defensive things like earth or fire, like not even shield, no heal, no nothing. Felt a bit meh as well. So I'd like to see the typo changes. Also, because the typos, due to the Ascendant token change, right, we cannot clump up as efficiently with smaller typos anymore. So I think they really did need a little range buff there. Then basic synergies. I think this is a really big change. Pretty much if we scroll through this, everything got added a 9 trade option. And the 9 trade is what 7 used to be before. So everything got just nerfed across the board pretty heavily. I think this is really interesting, right? Because the trades matter, like the power level of the trades is tuned down a tremendous amount, which in accordance of that makes hyper be more relevant than it was before. Because you get less from just having water, having earth, having fire, having whatever active, but you get far more from just having the hyper that counters the enemy. So I think that is just seemingly the way that the Illuvium team is taking this, where just having hyper be like the main focus, and I guess the main skill cap focus of the game, which I think that's like probably a good thing. I'm not sure how this is gonna play out in like a full blind positioning side of things though. So that's again this like idea, I don't know, the blind positioning thing, not sure. Especially if you make hyper matter more and more and more. But on the other side, this also means you're probably less forced to have, oh, this is like the current OP high power level thing, let me just keep playing it and forcing it forever, because no, the trades just give a whole lot less now. So you're not really forced into, I have to go for this 5 water, I have to go for this 3 water breakpoint. You can also just drop one of those Illuvials for a stronger Illuvial overall. I think I like that a lot, because it did feel like, like in TFT, for example, it is like a very big bait to play like a, I don't know, 2-star 3-cost unit over a 2-star 5-cost unit, even if the 2-star 3-cost unit like gives you a trade for your team. And the 5-star, the legendary like OP late game unit just is like a far better unit, and you don't get a trade for your team. Okay, who cares? Or like even, yeah, just like unit plus trade active in TFT usually is weaker than like 2-star 5 costs. 2-star like most strongest expensive units or something like that. In here in Illuvium, it did not really feel like that oftentimes, where it really felt like, no, just having your trades active is better than playing just more big units, more high tier units. And I think this change kind of goes in that direction, so I do like to see that. It's one of those fundamental noob traps, so to say, as well, that I think Illuvium is missing in that sense. There's very little opportunity for people to just like make mistakes in the recent arena setups, and I think this gives more room for them to make mistakes because they just value, oh, I need to have my trade active instead of just selling the tier 1 unit for a tier 5 unit late game, for example. Yeah, we see that like everything just nerfed and the 9 and 8 trade added on Rogue. Then a lot of composites are changed. Composite synergies have been adjusted around the new Illuvials along with the usual balancing changes. It should also be noted that every single composite synergy can now be reached without a bond required. So you have like a lot of more team comps with your ranger, a lot more interesting stuff basically, because now we can, right, a dust, enchanter, inferno, like so much stuff was only accessible via ranger bonding. Now we can access it just naturally. So you just like make more team comps happen, right? So Tsunami gets a small buff. I think that makes sense. It's interesting. Exodon gets a Harbinger unit. Exodon gets a damage buff and Tsunami gets a damage buff. Maybe there's something there. Toxic gets a buff. Makes a lot of sense. Toxic felt really underwhelming recently. Bloom, more slight buffs on 3 and 4. I mean, 4 you never really reach. 3 is fine, right? Like I guess like having 2 Bloom be weak in the sense makes sense because it's then you're not forced to play more Illuvials, right? You're not forced to play Lulura. You can just play like Phosphorus Ranger plus Hyper Carry support maybe. And at 3 you need to play Lulura, which is like a less Hyper Carry supportive unit. So yeah, I don't know. I think maybe Terrorbuild is gonna be fine. I'm still not a fan of this new Bloom thing with just like health and Omega power. I really like the health region part, but it is what it is. Maybe Terrorbuild is gonna be okay again. Shock, we pretty much went from 1 shock unit in a game to 3, so the numbers look tremendously nerfed, but in reality, we had 2 shock units, it was 250 each. Now, if we just play 3 with 150 each, that is pretty much similar. Like 2 times 250 is 500, 3 times 150 is 450, and we can access 4 in general, and 4 times 200 is 800, right? So now we can have shock for deal 800 damage, and previously we had shock for deal 500 damage, but it was only ranger plus a squiz, and now we have to play like far more units for that. That also don't really synergize that well with their other trades, right? It's like a revenant, and I guess you can just make ranger whatever. But yeah, like it's, I don't know, squiz with Psion, then the kangaroo with revenant, and what is the last one? Last one is Templar, right? So you have a fighter, a rogue, a Psion, and the ranger. I don't know, maybe there's something interesting to be made there. We'll see about that. Inferno, obviously Inferno has to get nerfed by the same logic, right? You only could access 2 and only with Ramfire and Ranger, and now you have the Poodlemorph added. So yeah, makes sense to nerf these numbers again. If you want to compare, right, 2 Inferno units at 2 was 4% max health damage, and having 3 at 2 is 6%, so having 3 Inferno is slightly better than the Inferno that we used to know from the previous patch, but keeping Ramfire and Poodlemorph and Ranger alive probably a bit more difficult, especially now with all the other Illuvials added and Shock added and so on. Tempest is getting nerfed because, well, air now also gives you extra dodge chance, so obviously that was incredibly positively impacting Tempest, and we didn't have any balance changes after the fundamental changes that if you have a Tempest Illuvial, it gets the bonus from air and from Tempest. Previously it wasn't like that, it was only Tempest, so all these numbers have to be adjusted down. The same goes for Spore, the same goes for like all the rogue things especially. This was incredibly benefiting the rogue trades, so yeah, just like nerfs here. This is like just adjustments that didn't make it into the last update pretty much, right? So just obvious stuff, makes a lot of sense. Small changes to the augments, Apex Empowerment gives a bit more crit chance, Corrosive Aura slight nerf. I really am happy to see this. Omega Can Crit should not exist as an augment here. And there's another one here, there's Survival Protocol, Indomitable effect. Like I think Survival Protocol with Indomitable and Devastation Surge with Omega Can Crit, those should not exist in the current augment system, so I'm happy to see them removed. I think that is very good. And yeah, like the other stuff is just small balance changes, which just makes sense, it's fine. Oh yeah. Alright, so that's it. That's what we have for the arena patch notes. I'm really hyped to have more Illuvials. I'm really hyped. I think the fundamental changes here are pretty good as well, because making these synergies less like crazy strong puts more emphasis on playing the correct Illuvials. just it allows you more room to be like, okay, I can put this Illuvial because it's good versus the strategy of my opponent's team. Like my opponent is playing a front to back or this or an assassin or and so on and so on, and you can adjust your team a bit more freely, I would say, because you don't have to be forced into I have to maintain my 3 water, 3 earth, 3 nature setup or like whatever, right? I cannot break my 9 synergies or my 5 and my triple 3 or my 5 and 3. You can maybe go down to like 2-3 synergies and have, I don't know, 3 Illuvial / Ranger, just have nothing, but they are just really, really powerful on what they are doing, on their abilities or whatnot. So I like that. I think that's a fundamental good change. It's something that TFT has been really good at with the legendary unit designs and their sets, that those are the powerful late game, and you're like the best late game bot in TFT is usually just like a bunch of high cost units, high tier units in Illuvium's comparison. So I wonder if we see that the end game board is just going to be a bunch of tier 5 Illuvials with like having obviously some traits and some bondings active, but with it not being like the predominant idea anymore. So I'm looking forward to that, and let me know what you guys think about PB4. It's probably out by a few days when you watch this video. How do you like playing it? What do you guys think about combat? What do you guys think about the new Illuvials and everything? Let me know in the comments, and see you guys in the next one.